Good afternoon, and welcome to a case study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad, for EDL 851 VA, Module 13. I am Evan Manning. First, let's look at Category 1, the problem identification and analysis. First is A, what we know. The background of the case study occurs in Crestview Elementary, which is a rural district. The district has 3 elementary schools, and Crestview has 15 teachers. The individuals involved are, first, Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson has been a principal for 1 year at first, and throughout the case study, this is her 2nd year. She's generally liked and experienced as an in-class educator, with double-digit years of service before her principalship. Mrs. Horton is a highly effective first-grade teacher. We know this because there are instances that are involved in the case study where she gets awards and has a lot of positive reviews. Those include a Teacher of the Year award presented by the district. However, she seems to be going through some things at home that are creeping into the classroom. The event in question are calls and emails about Mrs. Horton. She's late to work. Her attitude, confrontational. She's not getting along with peers. The individual scenario that's isolated in the text was of the new curriculum that was coming in, where the principal and other teachers seemed to be on board. Mrs. Horton, though, was not, and in fact was argumentative and confrontational in that question. Also, there's negative classroom interactions with students. Individual ones will be isolated upcoming. B, what we need to know. Information needing to be obtained includes: what's going on at home? How does the admin get to that truth? Is the classroom unsafe or just not efficient? This seems uniquely important. If the classroom is just not academically efficient, then we can obviously keep her on staff and work through some form of plan of improvement as per the evaluation and what the school directs. However, if the classroom is unsafe, a more urgent form of intervention would have to occur, and at that point, it would really expedite the process. These also have to do with the next 2 questions that would need to be obtained, which is there rehabilitation possible, and is there irrevocable harm? If there is, obviously at that point, we probably go beyond the question of how we fix things, and we go more to what do we need to do to try to act quickly, decisively for the safety of students. C is identifying the problem. The problem at hand, I think, is threefold. First, what can Mrs. Wilson do to help the teacher long term? Yes, this is important, and this is something that we need to try to identify. But almost a more pressing question is 2. What can Mrs. Wilson do for the students short term? Again, especially if there's a safety element here that just becomes a prior question, then the long-term health of what is happening with Mrs. Horton. And 3, what are the legal and union ramifications for actions? Like it or not, and especially when we try to intervene with other information we've learned in past modules as isolated in the rubric, we find that legal and union ramifications are great and are things that we as principals need to be thoughtful of. And obviously in this situation, which is specific to how the evaluation would occur and what type of discipline could come from that or ramifications with her job status, we would need to be thoughtful of those issues. Next is Category 2, the plan of action with strategies. There's 3 steps that I utilized. The first was to find a way to get to the bottom of what's happening at home. Again, before we do this, almost everything else is moot. I mean, yes, you could get rid of her immediately or transfer all the students or do nothing, but without knowing what's actually happening, it's very hard to know what is justifiable and what is the correct decision. The question is, how do we do that? So the data utilized would be first, a meeting with Mrs. Horton. Obviously, we don't know how that would play out, but that has to happen first. Also, communication with central office. In order to have these types of communications in this meeting, you're obviously going to cross a lot of boundaries that are more than just, or at least potentially more than just, the administrator teacher, but also at a more personal level. And with that, communication for your own safety as well would be important. And third could be secondary market help, i.e. a counselor or someone who could help Mrs. Horton with the things that she's going through and hopefully not only stop what's sort of bleeding into the communication of her classroom, but maybe positively bleed in with that help. Step 2 would be identifying the safety of the students and quickly setting up a plan of action. The data utilized here could include things such as student interviews, parent interviews, observational walkthroughs or observation notes from an evaluation tool, and any information from the discussion with Mrs. Horton directly could also be utilized. Again, how that plays out specifically probably sets up what we do very specifically, but as a general question, step 3 could include to investigate legal and union reactions to plans implemented in step 2, including research and communication with legal precedent and central office. Category 3, the resolution based on all student success. The rubric isolates that we really want to focus on the question of student success first. Because of that, we really want to do a few things to make sure that the case for resolution is correct. First, interviews must be fair and untargeted. Student safety must be first. Communication should be tantamount. Consequences aligned with set rules and thoughtfully directed with legal precedents and union ramifications in mind. And again, if that occurs, then the resolution would be focused on what's best for students, as isolated by the rubric. Category 4 is the debrief. There's 3 subsections here that were isolated. First are the thoughts. So what could have been done to prevent this from the beginning? And is this an isolated teacher or other issues? And again, these things go together. My number 1 question with my own thoughts about this is, again, why is there no first person ID? If a principal has a good sort of pulse on what's happening in the school, you would feel that through rumor or other interactions and communications, you would know that some of these things were bubbling up before you get a myriad of parent or individual student complaints. And even during the communication with the individual parent, which we'll get to in a moment, the principal at least says outwardly that they didn't have direct information that this was happening, which I think is problematic. Next are the feelings. I would be nervous about what was to come, as well as anxious for closure, but yet fear of backlash, specifically isolating legal backlash, as well as union backlash. Third are valuing. I would value opinions of other administrators in similar situations. I would value central office connections and through having some sort of safety protocols for myself, as well as the legal precedent of what to do, especially if we find out that there has to be some form of disciplinary action or contractual issues with renewal. 3 issues that are unresolved are open for further investigation. These can include, is there more coming out about Mrs. Horton? Again, we don't know, but I think that would be important to isolate. Are there legal ramifications coming down the pipeline? Again, depending upon what was said, what type of verbal abuse, and obviously if there was anything more than that, we would need to know because those things could be coming back at the school as being in charge of the safety of the students. And are there more students with personalized issues? Again, this is a unique instance. We saw the Julie Stafford incident where she says what's happening with her, and we have the parent getting involved as well as the meeting between Mrs. Horton, Mrs. Wilson, and Mr. Stafford. And again, without only being 1 student in a classroom of many, are there more coming? And that probably becomes very important to know. Lastly is category 5, the reflections. Component 1 was the educator leader at the building level applies knowledge that promotes success of every student. Examples, open communication with parents is key, quick and decisive action key for student safety and academic success. And 3, Being helpful to Mrs. Horton is important, but success for all students is a prior question. And I think this could obviously lead to some uncomfortable conversations or some communication back and forth, but that's ultimately your job as the number one facilitator of student safety, even beyond the individual teacher classroom. And if you do that, everything else should fall into place. And component 2 is again talking about well-being. So we have success first, but well-being second. When we look at well-being, we have a few extra things to pay attention to. First is the Julie Stafford situation has to be dealt with immediately. I think there's enough evidence to indicate that minimally Julie should probably not be in that classroom setting anymore because it probably is irreparable harm in that specific scenario. And number 2, following predetermined consequences as per Board of Education or school policies would be really important for the fair treatment as well as the safety for students. And again, minimizing that backlash is important. The more backlash that happens also upsets the culture and the well-being of the students. And number 3, student safety is tantamount. Again, nothing comes first, and the well-being for those students has to be a prior question than how Mrs. Horton is being treated, whether we like it or not, or even personalized fear of the administrator from some form of backlash. So I think with all those things in mind, it's really important to sort of realize the issues that are here and that the student safety coming first, as long as that happens, then the other issues such as Mrs. Horton's long-term ability to continue in education, as well as the safety of the head administrator in this situation to be free of sort of legal backlash or union backlash, should hopefully be minimized. And the works cited is here of the specific case study. Thank you.